We've learned from Henry Thoreau that people in 19th century New England were overly preoccupied with pursuing the necessaries and the luxuries, and some of those things our author proposes are hindrances to our good life. According to Thoreau, if we practice economy, if we simplify our living, then we will have opportunity to pursue the finer fruits of life, our author says. What did our author pursue, having simplified his living? That's our present topic. Well, clearly our author was a writer and wrote the book Walden. And in fact, our author wrote in his journal for 24 years, and we have that journal today that allows it to be studied. And our author published many essays and also gave lectures, which were the basis for the essays. Perhaps that's the activity he devoted himself to. Another good candidate for what our author pursued is teaching. We know that our author went to college in order to become a teacher, and I've mentioned the legend that our author resigned his dream job a few weeks after starting because he refused to practice corporeal punishment. Our author is also known as a founding environmentalist in America. So another good candidate for what he did is on the board here, nature study. Our author introduces his chosen task. He refers to it as his cherished activity on pages 15 and 19. And here our author is a very interesting writer. He makes several playful metaphors and comparisons, and here he tells us that there's some secrets to his trade or activity, and it's important to sort of keep those secrets and not to tell them. Looking ahead to our readings for next week, our author again introduces us to his mysterious activity. On pages 72 to 75 of chapter 2, our author provides some further insights. Let's hear some of the comparisons that our author makes to his activity. He tells us that he was like a reporter for a newspaper. That the activity does is a lot like that. And moreover, he says, I was like an inspector of snowstorms, he says. He was somebody who'd be outside in cold weather, in stormy weather, noting the rain or noting the snowfall. Our author says, my town could have hired me as a town officer. The thing I was doing is important for our town, but nobody was interested in hiring me, he says. And then more poetically, our author compares his chosen activity to being a basket weaver. He says, I too weave a kind of basket. It has a delicate texture, but I never really desire to sell my baskets, he says. And then similarly in chapter 1, our author tells us that he conducts a kind of private business, and he does this out in the woods and by the pond, and he refers to it as a business transaction. In chapter 2, when our author again talks about his mysterious activity, he compares his activity to a real estate agent who appraises the landscape and properties. Our author gives us a hint about this activity when he mentions some of the specific actions which he does. He searches, he watches, he waits and listens, he records what he sees, and he takes account, he makes accounts of what he sees. So there are several different tasks or subtasks which the author does. Here's a quote which I admire. It's on page 18. Referring to his mysterious activity, Henry Thoreau says, "It is a labor to task the faculties of a man." And finally, there's an important image that our author gives us on pages 15 through 19. He tells us that what he does is a lot like being an officer in a counting house in the age of exploration. A counting house is where imports would come in from the motherland or the mainland, and supplies for the people in the wilderness. And meanwhile, the goods that the wilderness are producing, beaver skins or pelts, that would go back to the motherland. And the officer's job is to oversee all of these transactions and to write them down and evaluate them. That's a lot like what Henry Thoreau was doing at Walden Pond, he says. There are enough hints in his mysterious descriptions that this activity has to do with nature, with all kinds of flora and fauna. He mentions trees, he mentions the weather, he mentions animals. So the best conclusion about the activity of Henry Thoreau is that it is nature study, informal practice of observing and identifying natural phenomena. And arguably, Walden is like the final record of this experience. So the writing activity of Henry Thoreau falls under the broad category of nature study. We know today that in addition to writing a journal and writing lectures and preparing essays from these materials, our author also collected many of his observations into a calendar, he called it. Calendar with a K. And this calendar he began sometime in the early 1850s, and he continued to fill out in this calendar many of the observations that he was making on a day-to-day basis. For example, when the first birds arrived in spring, or when the first flowers came out, or when the first hurricane arrived in New England. This for him were some of the most important natural phenomena. And we today have a name for this activity. It's a formal science now, and it's called phenology. Phenology is the scientific study of events and appearances indicating seasonal changes. So when Henry Thoreau refers to himself as a basket weaver, a person who weaved delicate baskets, we now believe he is referring there to his calendar, which he began keeping in the early 1850s, showing all kinds of phenological events in and around Concord. And we know that he intended to create a complete map of the natural phenomena in Concord according to the seasons. For us, what's interesting about phenology and nature study is that these activities combine several areas of intellectual thinking. They're, of course, scientific activities that involve observing and judging. However, phenological events are also often events that inspire contemplating. When an orchid is blooming in the woods and you come upon it, or perhaps a bird flies into the pond that hadn't been there for months, that is often a kind of event that's wondrous, that's wonderful. And we've learned from Aristotle and from Aquinas that wondering about amazing truths is a kind of higher kind of thinking called contemplating. So for Henry Thoreau, nature study includes both scientific observing and contemplating, and then moreover all of the record keeping and planning and excursion planning that Henry Thoreau had to do involves deliberating, prudent deliberating. So there are at least three areas of intellectual activity that are involved in pursuing this nature study. And that's one of the reasons why, for Henry Thoreau, this is a promising plan for an intellectual life, because it combines several different intellectual activities and virtues.